Matthew 27, starting in verse 32. Hugh asked me a moment ago if we were going to go back in time today, and it took me a minute to figure out what he was talking about. But yes, we are. We are going back. Last week, we raised Jesus from the dead. This week, we're putting him in the tomb, and so it's a little out of order. But all right, we're going to start in Matthew chapter 27, starting in verse 32. It says, "Now as they came out, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name, and him they compelled to bear his cross." Now, 2 weeks ago, when we left Jesus, he had been tried. He was on trial before Pilate, and he was unfortunately found guilty, even though Pilate knew that he was innocent. And then they had taken him, and the soldiers had mocked him, and they had beat him, and they had treated him just terribly. And the result of all of the things that he has endured today is that you see a man whose body is exhausted beyond the limit. He is so tired and so weak at this point that this cross, which was a very heavy beam that he would have been carrying, was really just too much for him to be able to carry any farther. And you kind of get the idea that perhaps he fell down, or just that he laid down. He just couldn't go anymore. And it's sort of devastating and heartbreaking to think about. But it also shows us, I think, something about the human person, and that is that it is possible to be faithful even beyond what the body can endure. Your body can be completely broken. Your person can be completely unable to move forward, but you can still be faithful to God even then. Christ was always faithful, even when his body could not do anything else. And I think that that is a great comfort to think about that possibility, especially some of us whose bodies don't work as well as others, and we know people like that. And that just because your body has stopped working doesn't mean that you can't continue to be faithful to God. Jesus was able to continue to be faithful. And so they found this man, Simon by name, and so he carried the cross the rest of the way for Jesus. And when they had come to a place, verse 33, called Golgotha, that is to say, place of a skull, they gave him sour wine mingled with gall to drink. Now, they come to this place. It's called place of a skull, and there's lots of guesses as to why. I've never seen any convincing evidence as to specifically why. Some people say that it was a place that had a large sort of structure, a rock of some kind that looked like a skull. They even say that they found it close to Jerusalem. Perhaps that's the case. I'm not seeing anything too convincing, but it's possible. Other people say that it was called the place of the skull because it's a place where there were dead bodies, skeletons on the ground, because this is where the Romans took people to crucify them. That, to me, that seems more likely, but I couldn't really tell you one way or another. But either way, place of the skull is not really a place that you want to be. It's not really a pleasant place. This is where they have brought Jesus, and it says that they gave him sour wine mingled with gall. Now, the idea of that is this is a painkiller. This is like morphine, or it's not exactly morphine, of course, but it's kind of the idea, something that you give a person who is in great pain, especially at the end of their life. And so they try to give him this painkiller, but it says in verse 34, he tasted it, he would not drink. I think what he was hoping for was water. That's what he cries for in different accounts. He cries out for water. He was hoping for some water, but when he tastes the painkiller, he would not drink it. He doesn't want in any way to numb this pain or to numb his senses. Now, we'll talk in a minute about why I think that is, but he rejects this painkiller. And it goes on, and it says in verse 35, they crucified him. I think that's why they offer the painkiller, because of what they're fixing to do to him. And I don't think I need to go into all the details about how they put a person on a cross, and I don't particularly like talking about it. It's just a painful thing to think about, and I'm sure that most of us know it. But he took that pain without any kind of painkiller, without anything to numb his senses. Just a horrifying and an awful experience.
But isn't gall very bitter?
I believe so.
Something is very bitter.
It's a bitter tasting thing, yes, ma'am. As some medicines are. I think it is a bitter tasting thing.
I've been told by several that have done a lot of research on this was to prolong their life so the torture could go on for longer.
Okay.
And that's what the Romans enjoyed doing, is putting people to death. They didn't care about it.
All right. I've not heard that particular thing. I think that's a possibility. From what I've read, I understand it to be more of a painkiller to get them so that they don't die from the pain. And maybe that's what they mean by extend their life. Sometimes pain can kill you.
Sure.
They don't want them to die during the attachment to the cross. They want them to die on the cross. And so perhaps that's what they mean by that.
Well, I'm wondering why they would give him painkillers, show any kind of mercy, since up to this time they had shown none that we see.
Right.
I mean, a crown of thorns, the whipping, the having to carry the cross and everything. So
I do think that as far as they don't want him to die while they're nailing him to the cross, and so you call that mercy or just call that that's just how they did it. But we do see that as we go through this, there are some people there who sort of take pity on him, and perhaps it's one of those that offer him the painkiller too. I'm not sure.
Well, I was just thinking, as vicious and cruel as they were, I find it hard to believe that they were trying to give him something to make him not hurt.
Right.
I think it'd be more in keeping with what you said, that they were trying to prolong his life.
Yes.
Maybe that's the way
They don't want him to die while they're nailing him to the cross.
wanting to ease his pain.
Could be, yeah.
Throughout history, there's people, even tribes up to the 1900s, they enjoyed torture
Sure.
to make a person miserable. They enjoyed it, and they would take measures to prolong their life while they were tortured.
Sure, yeah. Yes, sir. So they crucified him in verse 35. And then it says that they divided his garments, casting lots, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet. They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Now, this comes from Psalm 22 and verse 18. Psalm 22 and verse 18 is what Matthew was quoting right here. And when you go back to Psalm 22, the entirety of the psalm, it's a neat psalm. The entirety of Psalm 22 is about the Messiah who is dying or who is being tortured to death. And it says that in verse 18, it says, they divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. And so what Matthew has done is he has said, the psalmist talked about it all those hundreds of years ago in Psalm 22, but now it's taking place. This is the fulfillment of this prophecy. Now you might keep some kind of bookmark or your thumb at Psalm 22. We're going to come back to it in a little while, but that's where that comes from. And if you turn over to the book of John in chapter 19, and when John tells the story in John 19, he tells us a few more details about it. John 19 and verse 23. John 19:23 says, then the soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus, they took his garments and made 4 parts, to each soldier a part. All right, so they took what he had and they divided it kind of equally between them. And also the tunic. Now the tunic was without seam, woven from the top in one piece. And they said therefore among themselves, let us not tear it, but cast lots for it, whose it shall be. So the other pieces of his garment, right, they just ripped them into 4 pieces. They had seams and they weren't that valuable. But this tunic was sewn in such a way that if they ripped it, it would completely ruin the garment. And so what's interesting, and then John goes on in verse 24, and he quotes that same scripture and says, therefore the soldiers did these things. What's interesting about this is, notice with what care they had treated his clothing. They're so gentle with it, and they're so careful to preserve it, and they've cast lots to see which one of them gets to keep this very nice tunic. And here is a man hanging on the cross and all of the terrible things that they have done to him, and then here are that man's clothes, and they're treated like something truly special. And it kind of shows you this is where these people are at. This is, nobody cares. I mean, not nobody. Obviously, his mother and John and those people are there. But of the people, nobody is sad that Jesus is hanging on the cross. but they're sure going to make sure his clothes don't get torn apart because they get to take that home and keep it, you know. And so there's some significance as to why the psalmist mentions this in particular. Back in Matthew 27, starting in verse 36, it says, sitting down, they kept watch over him there, and they put up over his head the accusation written against him, this is Jesus, the King of the Jews. And so, in essence, they just sit down to enjoy the show. And the mocking, the spectacle of it all just continues. They put this sign up over him. This is Jesus, the King of the Jews. And I think it's in the book of John where it says it's in 3 different languages that they have written this down. And the Jews in the book of John even ask, will you please take that down? He's not actually the King of the Jews. And they're like, this is just fun. It's just fun to us. We just want to put it up there. Look at this king hanging on a cross. How silly is that? And so even as he dies, they treasure his clothes. They continue to make a spectacle and a mockery out of this man. And nearly everybody joins in. Verse 38, there were 2 robbers who were crucified with him, one on the right and another on the left. There are those who passed by who blasphemed him, wagging their heads and saying, you who destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross, right? And so they said, we heard what you said. You said you could rebuild the temple in 3 days, right? That's a ridiculous, preposterous notion. It took 50 or 60 years to build this temple. No one could build it in 3 days. And if you could do that, then you could easily come down from a cross. They turn his words around on him. Verse 41, the chief priest also mocking with the scribes and the elders, they said, he saved others, himself he cannot save. If he is the King of Israel, let him now come down from the cross, and we will believe him. Now, all the miracles that they've seen, they would have found a way to explain that too, I'm sure. He trusted in God. Let him deliver him now if he will have him. For he said, I am the Son of God. And so they admit readily, he saved others. They do not mind admitting all the good things that he did with his life as he hangs on a cross because of their own actions. They make fun of him because he was a man who did the right thing and helped people. And they accuse him of claiming to be the Son of God, but not truly being the Son of God. And then verse 44, even the robbers, even those 2 men who were dying next to them with the rest of their life moments away from being over, even those robbers who were crucified with him reviled him with the same thing. Now, I think Jesus doesn't take the painkiller, because the painkiller, it's you know, like alcohol. You know, it's like when you take NyQuil at night. You take NyQuil, you know, you can get a little bit loopy. That's why you just go right to bed and go to sleep, right? Because you need it medically, but it takes away some of your inhibition. Painkiller would be kind of like that. He needs to have his wits and his senses about him because he is the Son of God. He really does have the power to come down off of the cross. Think somebody says, why don't you just come down? And he doesn't have his wits about him. Maybe he just does come down from the cross. He's got to have his wits about him. And so he knows, or maybe assumes, that these people are going to be mocking him, and he has to be prepared to just listen, to just suffer while they mock him, and to not retaliate in any way.
Well, is it possible that he knew that, as someone has pointed out, one of the thieves evidently had a change of heart?
Yes.
Because he said, you know, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus said, you'll be with me today in paradise. So apparently we can, you know, infer from the 4 Gospels put together, as someone pointed out, that evidently one of the thieves had a change of heart. I wonder if, based on what you're saying, that one reason possibly that he turned down his supposed painkiller was he knew that thief was going to have a repentant change of heart and wanted to be conscious to talk to him.
Well, and certainly, you know, he clearly there is, I think it's Luke that describes this part of the story that Matthew does not describe, but that one of them apparently feels bad for what he says and for his life, and so he asks Jesus to remember him, and Jesus says, you will be with me in paradise this very day. And so That's kind of a neat part of the story that Matthew doesn't include. It goes on then into verse 45, and somehow it says the sun is hidden. He says from the 6th hour, and the 6th hour is about noon, and to the 9th hour, which would be about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So early part of the afternoon, he says there was darkness over all the land. So somehow the sun was hidden. Some people say there was an eclipse that day. Maybe it's just a bunch of clouds. The Bible doesn't tell us exactly how the sun was hidden, but everything was very, very dark from noon to 3 p.m. And if you were an ancient person, darkness like that was, they were very superstitious in ancient times. Darkness like that was an omen. It was something to be concerned about. Even now, when the clouds get really thick, and doesn't it just feel eerie outside? Even if we're not superstitious, it's just an eerie feeling for the clouds to get so dark, and we have maybe a little bit of trepidation about the storm that's coming. That they felt that, plus some, I think, because of how superstitious they were. And so there's kind of this eerie darkness over all the land. And at close to 3 o'clock, verse 46, at about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which he translates for us, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, this was, I think, true to how he felt in the moment. He's speaking from his experience hanging on the cross, but it's more than that. This was also a teaching tool that rabbis often used in Jesus' time period. What he says here, my God, why have you forsaken me, is the first verse of a psalm. Any guesses as to which psalm it is? 22. Yes, that's right. Psalm 22. If you want to flip back to that again. Opens with those exact words. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, this was a very common teaching tool that rabbis would use. They would say the first line of a passage, and then, because, they didn't all have Bibles on their cell phones like we do today, they memorized much more than we tend to today. His disciples were expected to repeat the rest of the passage back to him. And so what he's done is, he has said this verse, the first verse out loud, and then, there's scribes and Pharisees, educated people in the law of Moses and in the Old Testament. You almost can't help yourself. It's like when you get a jingle stuck in your head, and then you hear a piece of that jingle, and it just goes off in your head, and you can't stop it. It's just going to be there for 3 days, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's kind of like that. He has said the verse line. It's almost like you can't help yourself, at least in their minds. They're just going to pick right up with what comes next. Why are you so far from helping me and from the words of my groaning, so forth and so on. And I think what he's trying to do is, as they think through that psalm, as he hangs on the cross, he's hoping they notice some similarities. This is about, and even in Jesus' day, people understood this was a messianic psalm. This was about a future suffering Savior. And so the things that are happening to Jesus are the things that are described in this psalm. Notice it says in verse 14, I am poured out like water. All my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted within me. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue clings to my jaws. You have brought me to the dust of death. Right? He is completely, his energy level, his body is completely devastated, so he can't even carry the cross anymore. He's thirsty for water. He says in verse 18, we looked at that one earlier about dividing his garments and those kinds of things. And on and on throughout here, it describes things that you can read about as Jesus is dying. My favorite part is when you get to verse 21. He says, save me from the lion's mouth and from the horns of the wild oxen. You have answered me. So Jesus is hanging on the cross. And if they're really thinking about this psalm, which they should be because he brought it up, they're going to come to that part and think, there is an answer to Jesus' cry. My God, why have you forsaken me? And the answer is good things after verse 21 of Psalm 22. Zach?
You might have said something about it, but they pierced my hands and my feet. I would think it's
the people that have been
Yes.
thinking, oh man, it's literally describing the whole scene.
Literally describing the whole scene. Yes, thank you. Yeah, they pierced my hands and my feet is there. And which verse is that?
16.
16. Yeah.
You said something a while ago that made me think about a modern day analogy. You were talking about how they treasured these clothes that he had on while totally disrespecting him. It's been said of the environmental movement today that they're worshiping the creation rather than the creator.
Yeah.
The earth, worrying about the condition of the earth rather than worshiping the God who created it.
Sure.
Verse 8 is almost a direct quote of what the chief priests say.
Mm-hmm.
He trusted in the Lord, let him rescue him, let him deliver him since he delights in him.
Yes.
It's like the chief priest just said that,
And then he
and then now they're
cries
thinking
out.
about, and that's, I feel like that, if that doesn't step on your toes, just completely oblivious.
Yes, yes. So she said Psalm 22:8 is almost exactly what the chief priest had said in verses 42 and 43. He trusts in the Lord, let him rescue him, let him deliver him since he delights in him. Melanie?
I've heard that back in Matthew when Jesus cried out that I've heard it explained before, and I don't know if I fully agree with it, but it makes sense that when Jesus was on the cross, he took on the sins of the world, and God cannot look on sin. So he physically and spiritually felt God.
He felt separated from God.
And that's why he called that out.
I do think that.
Sounds like it could be. I'm not 100% convinced of what that meant, but
Right. Yeah, that's why I said I think there's an element of he really does feel this. And it's not just a teaching moment. This is what he feels, and like you said, because they took what was perfect and made it sin, and so he, of course, is still God and is still the perfect Christ, but he has our sins, and so I do think he feels it, but it's also the feeling and a teaching opportunity. So yes. Oh, okay. Did I see another hand back here? Some people think with their pens in the air, and it looks like they're raising their hands. So, all right.
Well, let me ask you this.
Yes, sir.
I can only imagine. Verse 16. What do you get out of that?
Of Psalm 22.
Yeah.
For dogs have, he's pointing to verse 16. He says, dogs have surrounded me, and the congregation of the wicked has enclosed me. And this is what Zach was bringing up. They pierced my hands and my feet. And so dogs is the idea of something unclean. Yes, to the Jewish people, they were unclean. And so to call a Jewish person a dog would be a great insult. But of course, the way that they've crucified him is just full of sin. And so it's also accurate as far as how their culture would think about a dog. And so that's describing all of his enemies as they stand around him, having said the things in verse 8 and having pierced his hands and his feet, just as Zach mentioned, to nail him to the cross. And so
Didn't know how cruel those Romans could be, because a place like that, there might be dogs show up for something to eat.
I think so,
I
yeah.
don't know.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
The soldiers would have been Gentiles, right?
Yes.
Gentiles.
Mm-hmm.
The justice system that ended up actually executing Jesus was
Gentiles,
Gentile.
yeah. Which is also, they called the Gentiles dogs, and so could have a dual meaning there even of the Jewish people and the Gentiles who were around
Did
him.
they bury those people that hung on the cross?
Some did and some didn't. It just depended if you had a friend to come get you down or not.
Okay.
Did they bury the people who they hung on the cross? Yeah.
I went to Israel back in the mid-90s. They showed us the place where ostensibly this happened. Of course, now, we're taking the word for it.
Right.
It is as ordinary looking as any cow pasture between
Sure.
here and Gilmer. And it just shows that, God doesn't have to have some majestic setting to do something awesome.
Awesome. That's right. Yes. So, yeah, in verse 16 it says the congregation of the wicked, and I think especially that part would be pointing at the Jewish element. That word congregation would be thinking of the idea of the Jewish people gathered. But I do think Gentiles could be thought of with dogs too, as far as that goes. And so,
Hey, Scott,
yes, sir.
in all this time, we do our searches and studies and fascinated by Christ being crucified. But I always thought that started at the moment that Pilate sent him out, crucify him.
Sure.
And here it says, then they crucified him.
All right.
So until he was nailed to the wood, to the tree, then in Matthew there, in 27, it's saying that he, do you have a thought on that?
At what moment was he crucified? Yeah. You could think he's been crucified in a way since before the foundation of the world. That's what 1 Peter 1:21 says, that this has always been God's plan.
But physically?
Physically, it's when they nail him to the tree.
Okay,
yes, sir.
gotcha.
Yes, sir.
Huh.
So, yes.
I just want to ask this question. I've always wondered.
Yeah.
When Jesus was hanging on the cross, he looked down and told John to take care of his mother. Where were his brothers?
Well, it doesn't tell us where they are at the moment.
Well,
Yes. No, I
I
think it's a good question. We know that and I think that's important to think through because of what it implies. We know that his brothers at this point don't believe him, and you don't really see the brothers believing until after his resurrection, and so if I'm his brother and I don't believe in him, I'm not going to be there when he's crucified because I don't want to get accused of being caught up with that and get crucified myself. They're probably not there. His mother is there. But I think more than that, because you're right, he's the oldest son. Normally it should go to the next oldest son. But whenever, and this is in the book of Mark, if you look at Mark chapter 3 and verse 31, we're told, let's go back to verse 21 first. In Mark 3:21, it says, his own people heard about all the things that Jesus was doing, and so they went to lay hold of him, for they said he is out of his mind. If they don't believe him, they're concerned he's going to get himself killed or something. He's out of his mind. And so in verse 31, when his brothers and his mother came standing outside, he tells the people, he says in verse 34, here are my mother and my brothers, for whoever does the will of God is my brother and my sister and my mother. And so by asking John to take care of his mother, he's saying he wants someone he can trust like family. And that's not always flesh and blood family. That's more church family. And so he's looking to John to be her new son instead of his brothers who don't believe.
I just always thought that was odd since I knew what the custom was.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. That shows you what Jesus is and what our priority should be as far as relationships go. Yes.
This is a dumb question, but I just never, since Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they all had to be there, right?
Well, the only one it seems that was actually at the cross was John himself, and that you can find that in the book of John. The other ones all ran away, and so perhaps they were watching from afar, but they certainly weren't.
They wrote it all down. They wrote the book, and so you see my question, right? I mean, why? How do they know? I mean,
how do they know?
Details?
Right. Well, and you think Luke actually wasn't there at all. This predates Luke's. He's not an apostle, and it predates him. And Luke was a doctor who was a very good note taker, and it seems he talked to people as well as he was inspired by the Holy Spirit. Mark, the same. Mark is not an apostle. He seems to be writing down what Peter has told him about it, and he's inspired by the Holy Spirit. And so, they, just like any book writer, they had resources, people they talked to and interviewed and things like that.
Holy Spirit, I guess I left that part out.
Yes, yeah, he's also making sure that they get it right. And so, but yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, because we find out on the day of Pentecost that they're given the abilities to be able to speak. Didn't know what to say yet, but the Holy Spirit was going to speak for them.
Yeah.
Just like the Holy Spirit was able to tell them what to write down.
Sure. Yeah. So.
Am I correct in that it seems to me like I once heard that the crucifixion was masterminded, arranged for the Jews, but carried out by the Romans?
Well,
is that correct?
As far as like Jesus being crucified, yes, that was their goal. The Jews, they worked to make all this happen. Pilate was sort of just a pawn in their game. So, yes, sir. All right. In verses 47 through 49, that whatever Jesus intended, they aren't getting it. Some of those who stood there when they heard that said, this man is calling for Elijah. Now he says Eli, which is God, but they have this tradition in Jewish culture that Elijah's one of the two people who never died. He was taken up in the whirlwind, and that's in 2 Kings chapter 2. But so they had this fable in Jewish tradition that Elijah would come and save prophets from bad situations because he'd never died. And so they're kind of calling on that. He's calling for Elijah. Someone in verse 48 takes pity on him. He runs, took the sponge, filled it with sour wine, and put it on the reed, and offered it at him to drink. Right? He feels bad for Jesus, perhaps, because he's suffering on the cross. He tries to give him the painkiller again. But the rest don't care. Let him alone. Let us see if Elijah will come to save him. And so, verse 50, Jesus cried out again with a loud voice, and I always thought this was interesting. He yielded up his own spirit. And he said it himself. He said, I lay down my own life. I take my own life up again. And he means that in the sense that he willingly went to the cross. But it seems even at the last minute, he decides the moment that he goes. He suffered for as long as he intended to. And when he had accomplished what he came to accomplish, he said, it is finished. And he let his spirit go. And
He said you held up the spirit, though.
Yielded up. Yeah, he let it go. He yielded up the spirit. Yes, ma'am. All right.
At what point did he say, the Father forgive them for they know not what they do?
That is, I think Luke and John record that, and if I remember right, you'd have to double check. He says that before he says, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. Certainly before he says it is finished. He says that.
Basically, they were casting lots.
I believe that's correct. Thank you, Melanie. Yes, ma'am. She said while they were casting the lots and those kinds of things is when he said, forgive them, they know not what they do. So he dies, and then we have this description of the overwhelming amount of evidence that those who would take notice could see. Verse 51, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth quaked, and the rocks were split. Graves were opened, and bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised, coming out of the graves after his resurrection. Now, they were raised from the dead, but they didn't come out of the graves until he came out of the grave. But dead people are now walking the streets, and it says they went into the holy city and appeared to many. There's Uncle Waldo. He died last spring, but now he's come to tell us that Jesus was raised from the dead, and that seems impossible. So I don't know about that. And then verse 54, when the centurion and those with them, now the centurion, he is the Roman soldier in charge of this crucifixion. And they were known for being typically very moral, good people in ancient times. And so he has a tough job. But it says, when the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and the things that happened, they feared greatly, saying, truly, this was the Son of God. Now, that's a really big deal to an ancient person. And here's why. First of all, when you're talking about earthquakes, people in ancient time understood that earthquakes were a symbol of kingdoms being destroyed and a new kingdom replacing it. Now, the earthquake really happened, right? They saw this earthquake happen. But notice Haggai chapter 2 and verses 21 to 22. In Haggai chapter 2 and verse 21, there's a prophecy. It says, speak to Zerubbabel, the governor of Judah, saying, I will shake heaven and earth. Right? That's talking about an earthquake. Here's what that means to them. In verse 22, earthquake means, I will overthrow the throne of kingdoms. I will destroy the strength of the Gentile kingdoms. I will overthrow the chariots and those who ride in them. The horses and their riders shall come down. Everyone by the sword of his brother. Earthquakes, they understood to be symbolic of a kingdom being destroyed so that a new kingdom can take its place. That's what Hebrews describes in Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12, starting in verse 25. In Hebrews 12:25, it says, see that you do not refuse him who speaks. For if they did not escape who refused him who spoke on earth, much more shall we not escape if we turn away from him who speaks from heaven, whose voice then shook the earth. Right? That's the voice of God, shakes the earth. That's an earthquake. He says, but now he has promised, saying, yet once more I shake not only the earth, but also heaven, just like the prophecy from Haggai. Now this yet once more indicates the removal of those things that are being shaken, as of things that are made, that the things which cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, verse 28, since we are receiving a kingdom, right? Shaking the earth, earthquakes are about removing one kingdom to put a new kingdom in place. Since we are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken, there is a kingdom that no earthquake can get rid of, which cannot be shaken. Let us have grace. Now that kingdom is what Daniel describes in Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2, starting in verse 24. Daniel chapter 34, starting in verse 34. This is when Nebuchadnezzar has that dream about the statue. And then at the end of the dream, it says in verse 34, you watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. And the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth, right? That statue, what did the different metals represent? Kingdoms, right? Kingdoms. It says there's a big stone that comes and destroys all the other one and becomes a mountain. It becomes a big kingdom of its own. Chapter 2 and verse 44, he says, in the days of these kings, now the last kingdom of the statue was the Roman Empire. In the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall be left not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. That's Daniel's interpretation of that rock. The rock that was hewn without hands, right? That's God making this kingdom, a kingdom that will never be destroyed. And so that earthquake was representative of one kingdom being destroyed and another one taking its place. That kingdom, which is the church, which is God's kingdom on earth, spiritual kingdom on earth, that kingdom being the one that Jesus was dying in order to set in motion, it coming into existence. And so there's the earthquake. There is the veil of the temple. This is from Leviticus 16. In Leviticus 16, it describes the Day of Atonement, that one day when the high priest could go into the Holy of Holies. That was the only time he could go in there, one day a year. That veil, it even says that no other priest could be in any part of the temple when he was in that room. It was a special thing. It's ripped in half, right? Somebody else, the idea is somebody else is going to go in there. And we know from Hebrews chapter 9 that somebody else is Jesus in the true Holy of Holies. He's the one that's going in there. And so you have the temple veil being ripped, you have the earthquake, you have all those dead people walking around talking about Jesus. And the centurion sees not even all of that, he just sees the earthquake. He's a Roman, right? He's not a Jew. He understands. Now, to the Romans, who was the Son of God? Caesar. Right? The king of the empire. His father is a god, according to the Romans. The king of the empire is the Son of God. And not the Son of God, a Son of God. And he says, truly, this man, right? He was a king. They put it on above his head. This is Jesus, the King of the Jews. He was a king. If someone dies and the world goes dark and an earthquake happens at that time, the Romans said, I believe he's a king. Right? He is a son of God. If he can see it, why can't the Jews, who know all the prophecies, who know all the other things that the Romans probably don't know, why can't the Jews see it if the centurion can? This is very shameful to the Jews. All right.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
About, you mentioned Daniel 2:44.
Yes, sir.
Isn't this one of the verses that people that believe in premillennialism use as a so-called proof text for their theory that there's going to be a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ on the earth?
Daniel is often used for things like that, yeah. But you know, he's just talking about the starting of the church there, or the
I
kingdom.
realize that's a digression from the main subject.
Yes, and we're running short on time, Philip.
What?
We're running short on time.
Okay.
Thank you, Bill. All right. Verses 55 and 56, he's reminding us there's a lot of reliable eyewitnesses to this. There's many women who followed Jesus from Galilee. They ministered to him. They were looking on from afar. There's Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's sons. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 6, it tells us that more than 500 people saw Jesus, and these women were some of those who saw his crucifixion. Right? Back to Zach's question, how did some people who wrote about this know so much details? These women lived for a long time afterwards and could describe it in great detail because they saw so much of it. And then we get to his burial. It says, verse 57, when evening had come, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who himself also had become a disciple of Jesus. Now, John tells us he's a secret disciple. He's not yet wanted to claim it because of fear of the Jews. John also tells us, and John's the only one that tells us, that Nicodemus helps him. Nicodemus, who came to him at night to ask him questions, Nicodemus helps him at this time and sort of outs himself as a believer in Jesus. But Matthew just tells us that he's a rich man and he became a disciple of Jesus. This man went to Pilate, asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate commanded the body be given to him, and when Joseph had taken the body, he wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, laid it in his new tomb, which he had hewn out of the rock, rolled a large stone against the door of the tomb, and departed. And then notice this, there are still eyewitnesses. Mary Magdalene was there, and the other Mary sitting opposite the tomb. Right? They saw all of these things happen. They followed him to the tomb. They sat there outside of the tomb until they had to go home and wait until the first day of the week. That feels familiar. When did we talk about that? To go back and to do all of the other things to him. And this even is prophesied. Isaiah 53:9. In Isaiah 53:9, it tells us that he would be buried in a rich man's tomb. Every detail of this pretty much has been prophesied in the Old Testament. And then finally, his enemies take precaution. Verses 62 to 66 describes how the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. And notice this amazes me. They understood this better than his disciples did. They say, we remember while he was still alive how that deceiver said, after 3 days I will rise. He said that over and over again. And when he does rise, the disciples don't even believe it at first until they see him with their own eyes because they just didn't get it. These are sharp people. The Pharisees and the scribes, they know the law very well. They understood exactly what he was saying. They just didn't want to believe it. That's a hard heart, you know? And so they understood that he said that. And so they asked that they be allowed to secure the tomb. And Pilate says in verse 65, you have a guard. Go make it as secure as you know how. And so they sealed the tomb and they set the guards. And we'll never know what happens next because we talked about it last week, and next week we're going to move on to something else. But you know, yeah. So yes, ma'am.
What kind says this is the last kingdom. It will always stand.
That's right.
That should give us as Christians today a lot of comfort just to know that, because I think we all kind of feel like Christians are being persecuted today on some level.
That's right.
And so it's going to work out.
It's going to work out because we are a part of the kingdom that no matter what they do to our bodies, we are always secure spiritually because we're part of that kingdom that will go on forever and ever. Even when the earth is gone, that kingdom will continue in heaven. And so, Kenny?
Mary knew that her son was special from the get-go.
Yes.
And so she trusted and believed her son. That's all it amounted to. She was ready for him to do what he said he was going to do.
Yes, but I can't imagine how devastating that would have been to.
Terrible.
Yeah.
Thinking about the women that were there, one of them probably wove that tunic.
I thought that too. Yeah.
I just think about how angry I would be if I had woven that tunic for Jesus, watching those soldiers cast lots for it
Mm-hmm.
would have just made me so angry.
Yes.
And if one of them had been a Southern woman, she would have gone over there and smacked some people around.
I didn't realize that the disciples had doubted him. You know, I knew about Thomas. Said, I'm not going to believe it unless I put my hand in there.
Yes.
I did not realize there was doubt among the others.
Even in Matthew, if let's see, well, no, it's in Mark. Mark describes it, but in Mark it talks about how none of them except for Peter, or no, sorry, last week we looked at this. John was really the only one who believed that he was raised from the dead without actually seeing the body alive for himself. The rest of them really thought, they said that they thought it was like old wives' tales or fables or something like that. So, yeah. All right. Well, we will wrap it up there. Thank you for your attention.